people here this evening. And this is our continuing series of town halls to provide information to our members across the Commonwealth. This is the second town hall we have had in 2023. So with that, I would just like to turn this back to Jen Muroff, because she will be coordinating and moderating this evening, and we are looking forward to a wonderful program. And for those who don't know, Jen is the chair of our Legislative Action Committee, so she is in extremely busy mode at this time with her committee, as the legislative session is new this year, and she will explain all that. So again, thank you for joining us. Jen, I pass it back to you. Thank you for organizing this.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. So before we begin, we just wanted to review some community norms. And if everyone can go ahead and mute themselves if they're not already muted, that would be great. Okay, so our community norms, we want to be respectful, assume positive intent, but understand impact, bring your full self and limit distractions, use the chat feature to ask questions, and message staff with any private comments or concerns. And with that, great. So happy spring. Welcome to part 1 of the March Town Hall series. We will have a part 2 on March 29th, which is LWVMA supported legislation for 23 and 24. And Lily and Bryn will drop that registration link into the chat. And we also wanted to make sure everyone was registering for our March 28th Women's History Month event in Gloucester. We have excellent panelists and we'd like folks to join us there. It proves to be a great evening. And Lily and Britt, I just want to make sure everyone's muted. I'm getting some background and I'm not sure. There we go. Great, thank you. Great, so we are thrilled and honored to host Senator Liz Miranda this evening. Senator Miranda will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions via the chat. So prior to her election to the Senate, representing the 2nd Suffolk District, Senator Liz Miranda served 2 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. She will offer us her unique legislative perspective, having served in both chambers, and can really give us the inside of how a bill actually gets passed. Senator Miranda is the chair of the Joint Committee on Racial Equity, Civil Rights and Inclusion, vice chair of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies, and serves on several more committees, including Joint Ways and Means. Our legislative specialists work with Senator Miranda on her policy priorities of Black maternal health, environmental justice, reform of the criminal legal system, and voting rights for the incarcerated as part of the VOTES Act. Welcome, Senator Miranda.
Thank you, everybody. I have a lot of energy, even though I'm super tired. It's been a very full day. I started my morning at 9 a.m. with METCO. I'm the vice chair or the Senate chair of the METCO caucus. Then I went to Fitchburg for 5 hours for the Ways and Means hearing, where I got to talk about health policy, the DTA, the Office of Refugees. Then I came back to Roxbury and met with some Uber and Lyft drivers of Somali descent, read my bill that is trying to make sure that they get benefits and rights and are not independent contractors so that they can be protected and have the right to do a very American thing, which is to form a union. And I'm here with you. And so that is a day in the life of a Massachusetts senator that represents 180,000 people. We sit on 6 to 8 different committees. We chair a committee, and then we vice chair a committee, and then we sit on a bunch of other ones. So I'm gonna take the liberty to ask for 3 things. One, that it's okay that I spend about 5 minutes telling you my background and my story, because I think it'll lead you to understand the way that I legislate and my journey to the State House. I'm kind of like a unicorn, and it's sad that it's 2023 and we still need unicorns to run for office. 2 that I love to hear who I'm talking to. And so because we don't have time to hear from everyone, I would love if we could use the chat and folks could maybe say their name, their town or neighborhood. And if I'm their senator, if they live between Hyde Park all the way to the South End here in Boston, and maybe one issue that keeps you up at night. So name, neighborhood or town, and an issue that you care a lot about that keeps you up at night. And while I tell my story, you guys can populate the chat. Then I'll tell you part two, if it's okay, after I tell my story and you guys are filling out the chat, that I actually take the time to say what I think are the 6 to 10 steps that take an idea or an issue to become a law in Massachusetts. Is that okay? Thumbs up? We good? So I was born 1980 here in Roxbury. My mom was a teen immigrant mom. She went to Madison Park High School here in Roxbury, and she had to drop out of school, even though my mom was very intelligent. She got pregnant, and reproductive justice and reproductive rights in the late 70s was a big topic, but it didn't reach all women. And so I love myself, but my mom was forced to have a baby and go to work in Boston's hotels. I'm really proud to say that my mom is still a cook in Boston hotels and is a proud Local 26 union member. And after helping me get elected in 2018 to 2019, my mom participated in her first union rally to bring more rights to her and her fellow workers in Boston hotels, demanding a fairer contract. So I like to think that a lot of the things that I've done in my life are inspired by my mother's hard work and generosity, but I was able to return the favor as a graduate of John D. O'Brien and Wellesley to come back to my community to inspire women like my mother to continue to fight. I grew up in a neighborhood in Boston that there are 2 movies and a book about. The movies are called Holding Ground and Gaining Ground, and the book is called Streets of Hope. If you want to learn a little bit about why I share a lot about where I grew up, is it was a neighborhood that was the most environmentally unjust community in the city of Boston, but also in the Commonwealth. And regular everyday people, Italian and Irish seniors who refused to move from this community after busing was laid upon their families to desegregate schools. There were a lot of mothers who did not want to leave their husband's house or the house that they raised their children. And in this community, there were Puerto Ricans coming from the South End. There were African Americans also coming from the South End. And here was Cape Verdeans coming to this country after a civil war against colonial rule in Africa, against the Portuguese, who could not afford to go anywhere else. And so this community that had 1,400 parcels of vacant land, some due to redlining, some due to arson for profit, but most of it due to urban renewal gone wrong. They knocked down 5,000 homes to build a highway that the community fought back, was the first neighborhood in the country to form an organization called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and they actually got eminent domain power. And I like to think about that we went through the worst of times, the crack epidemic, gun violence, and urban renewal, and all those things that I talk about, environmental injustice. But these neighbors banded together. Some couldn't even understand each other, but they knew that their kids deserved better. And I grew up learning organizing and learning about youth power in this neighborhood. Even though we were poor, I did not know that we were poor until I got to Wellesley. And I was like, oh, shoot. My mom is a cook. My father was incarcerated and deported, and so was my oldest brother. And at Wellesley, I finally met people whose parents were doctors and lawyers, and many of them were brown like me, and I had never had that experience in my neighborhood. So I like to think that I coupled my sort of fire and learning how to organize for my community. I learned a lot about love and generosity for my people and my family. And then I learned a lot about women and the idea that I was a feminist or a womanist fighting for women's rights and girls' rights from Wellesley. And so I did this work for 20 years of my life. I was a nonprofit leader. I always wanted to come back to my community to show girls like me it could be done. Because when I was growing up, I didn't see anybody. I didn't see anybody that went to Harvard or Wellesley. I didn't see anybody who was a doctor or lawyer or even a politician. And so once I got to Wellesley and I was empowered, I used to remember, now we call them siblings, because we're incredibly inclusive on the campus of Wellesley. I'm sure you guys have read the Globe. And if there's any Wellesley alums, I'd love to hear that. Wellesley used to have these signs on the campus that said women who would make a difference. And I used to pass by those signs every day, working my 2 jobs, trying to survive in a very hardcore academic, rigorous environment. And I would look up and I'd see these signs and it'd be like, you're going to make a difference. And I thought to myself, by the time I was a senior, I could go to iBanking, I could go to grad school, but how will I make a difference? And my community kept coming up to me like, you're going to graduate Wellesley. This is an established institution, the best women's college. Sorry, Smithies and Mount Holyoke and Barnard grads. We are the top of the line. And this is what I heard in 2002. And so I decided to come to my community, and I spent the 15 to 20 years as an entrepreneur, as an educator. I taught college business. I ran organizations in Roxbury. And then in 2017, the most devastating thing that I think could happen in anyone's life is that I lost my little brother to homicide. And it paralyzed me. And sorry if I get emotional, because I actually love this part about me, that I'm still very human. And if any of you guys have gone through something traumatic in your life, you understand that it really changes you. And after being paralyzed for 3 months in what I call deep grief, I didn't know that grief could cause physical harm, not just emotional harm. 7 people came up to me and said, "What are you going to do, Liz?" And I was like, "I don't know." And one of them was a young person who said, "You should run for office." And I said, "Girls like me don't run for office." And after saying no, hell no, absolutely not, and even in my native Creole and even in my Spanish language that I adopted from my neighborhood, people kept coming up to me to be like, "You're the perfect person to run for office because you were born and raised in this community. You know the good times and the bad times, and you can learn how to run for office." So long story short, I went to Emerge over a weekend. I learned how to run for office. I called 2 of my college friends, one who went to Wellesley with me and another one who had gone to Bentley, and said, "Do you think I should run?" And they said, "Absolutely, yes." I went to my mother. I said, "Do you think I should run?" And she said, "Absolutely not. You're crazy." But within 24 hours, my mom had asked me, "Well, how much money do you need?" And this single immigrant woman who gave birth to me in 1980, who had been working in Boston hotels making minimum wage, was my first $1,000 check. And my mom said, "I'm not sure if this is good for you. I'm really scared for you as a young Black woman from the hood to do this, because I see what they do to politicians on TV." My mother loves Channel 7 News. And she said, "But I hope that you will feel the fear and do it anyway. I hope you will do it scared." And that's what I did. I did it scared. I beat 4 men. I set a record of over 10,000 people voting in my community. And this past January, I won my 3rd election in a highly contested race. And I like to think that I've done it for my brother, I've done it for my mother, but I'm doing it also for women of different economic backgrounds, of different racial backgrounds, regardless if you're from Pittsfield or P-Town or Roxbury like me. Women have not been represented in the State House. Only about 221 women have ever served in office in the Massachusetts Legislature, and there've been over 20,000 men. And so we've got a long way to go. And I hope that you're inspired by something I shared today about my story, about turning my pain into power, or feeling the fear and doing it anyway, or just trying to make a difference in your own little world. And so I come with all this stuff to the State House as a survivor, as a person who has a lot of privilege now that I'm a Wellesley woman, now that I am a senator, and I think about that every day. And as an African-American woman and the first Cape Verdean woman in the country to serve in a legislative body, and only the fourth Black woman in Massachusetts history. It took until 1993 for a Black woman to serve here in Massachusetts. And if you know anything about Massachusetts history, that's a long time away from when the Mayflower arrived here on our shores. And so I hope that you will think about yourself and think about women who are not represented in these spaces, and to think about how you can be a good ally and a good supporter. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I hope folks really take a piece of what I shared. So when I got into the State House in 2019, I didn't know how to write a bill. I thought lawyers, you had to be a lawyer to be a state rep or a senator, because almost every man that I had met that was in the State House was an attorney. And the women that had actually achieved stature, particularly the Black women, were all attorneys. So you had Senator Diane Wilkerson, you had Senator Linda Dorsina Forey, even Senator Edwards is an attorney. And here I was, someone who wasn't sort of legally minded or didn't know how to write a bill. But the good news is you don't need to know how to write a bill, because there are advocacy organizations that like the League for Women Voters, who actually dispel all the myths and share how you actually get a bill across the finish line. So these are my 7 to 10 steps that I believe actually help you accomplish turning a bill or an idea or an issue into a law. 1, you've got to think about the issue or the thing that you want to change that keeps you up at night. And I use the keep you up at night because for months, I kept thinking, when my brother died, that I knew how to get resources. And Massachusetts kept telling me, we have the lowest number of gun deaths in the country. We have tough gun laws. And I kept thinking, then why is it that in Lowell, in Lawrence, in Brockton, in New Bedford, in Roxbury, in Mattapan, why are our children dying? Why are our loved ones dying? And what about being the safest nation, technically, safest state in the country, sorry, not nation, because we're not really safe in this country, the safest state per se, tough gun laws isn't trickling down to our community. So it keeping me up at night. And I knew that I wanted to do something in honor of my brother, to make sure that other women and other families could actually go to somebody who went through the same thing and be able to say, I don't know, Liz, where to get resources. And I could say, the Peace Institute, the Mass Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Do you know that we have a Mass Office of Victims Assistance that gives money to families to bury your loved one? Those are things that are not shared in my community that I knew. So think about the issue, then you got to find a champion. Is there someone that either represents you or works on that issue in that building, or is in an advocacy organization? Most people, for example, think about reproductive rights. Who comes to mind as soon as you think about reproductive rights? You think about Planned Parenthood. When you think about voter enfranchisement, who do you think about? You think about the League. You think about other organizations. When you think about civil rights, you think about the ACLU. And so thinking about who is actually already doing this work and aligning your idea or issue area to that organization outside the building is an important first, third step. And the second step, as I just shared, is finding a champion in that building. The fourth step is that the bill gets assigned to a committee. So once you work with your champion, and we work with Senate and House counsel, or outside advocacy organizations who actually draft these bills, we file the bill. So in January, over 6,500 bills were filed at the State House. If you want to know what your rep or senator actually filed. If you don't know who that person is, you can actually go to malegislature.gov, and there's a page on every one of us out of the 200 legislators that are in the State House. So first step, what's the issue or the idea that comes to mind that to make something better or something that keeps you up at night? 2, you find a champion. 3, you find an advocacy organization. 4, you draft this bill. And 5, once that bill gets assigned to a committee, you then can build, usually when it gets assigned to a committee, it gets a date. And that date is called a hearing date. And this is where advocacy organizations can really help. And I like to think that COVID was a gift and a curse. The curse is that we're still in this thing. It's cost us a lot of our family members. But the gift is that we thought we couldn't do hybrid sessions and testimony. And that was a huge inhibitor of people who are working class, people who speak different languages, or people that are differently abled, not being able to come to the State House to testify. But now we have hybrid hearings so folks can share their voice. So after you get the hearing date, you work with your family, your friends, your community, these advocacy organizations, a coalition, or you work with your champion to provide testimony. And testimony can either be verbal, you can sign up to testify in person or online, or you could submit a letter or an email to the committee chairs to be able to share your concerns with the bill. One bill in particular that really changed my life was after George Floyd was massacred on sort of live social media, and Breonna Taylor was killed due to a no-knock warrant, and Ahmaud Arbery was killed. I immediately thought about when I was in college, I remember Amadou Diallo. And if any of you guys remember Amadou Diallo, he was a young man, an African immigrant who went to reach for his wallet to give his ID to the police officers and was shot multiple times. And actually, when they found him, he had his wallet in his hand. And when George Floyd happened, I knew that this is something that was happening in communities across the nation and even in Massachusetts. And even though people said it did not happen in Massachusetts, every year, 30 to 35 people die at the hands of police here in Massachusetts. And even though we have safe schools and safe communities and a low number of gun deaths, as a Black woman, I knew that I had to do something. And I didn't know how to write a bill, remember? And so I went to the ACLU, I went to the NAACP, I went to attorneys who live and work in my community. And I said, I've looked around and I've waited for my colleagues to say they're gonna do something. And no one's doing something, but in my community, we're in an uproar. I could spend 3 hours with you tonight and I could share a name a minute of the 1,000+ people that die at the hands of police every year, and they look like me. I could talk about Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, DJ Henry, who was from Easton, Massachusetts, and I could go on and on and on. And so I work with these group of folks, and they built a coalition of over 100 different organizations to be able to lobby the State House to do something here in Massachusetts within 6 months. And so I filed my bill and act to save Black lives, and I banned chokeholds, banned no-knock warrants, created a duty to intervene, created de-escalation language, and also created language about an independent review board, because Massachusetts was one of 4 states that did not have a licensing and delicensing method. If you learned anything about George Floyd, other than that he was killed, is that the gentleman that put his knee on his neck had 17 infractions. He didn't deserve a badge. He didn't deserve to be an officer because he never intended to protect and serve him. And the other 3 officers that put their bodies on the rest of George Floyd's body, or who stood there watching, knew that their colleague did something wrong and did nothing. And so we don't want to keep doing nothing or allowing folks that don't deserve to be officers or correctional officers to serve in the Commonwealth. Long story short, then they took my bill, they formed a committee in the State House, that actually tried to bring both sides together. As you can imagine, many people felt like Massachusetts didn't have a problem and felt that law enforcement officers were being treated unfairly. But I took the approach that when we help those that are most marginalized, we help everyone. So I've shared the first 6 steps. So you work with your advocacy organization, you provide your testimony. Here's a unique thing about my strategy that not every elected will share. There's an internal game and there's an external game. The internal game is getting your champion or your filer to actually work to get co-sponsors and to talk to their colleagues about why this issue is an issue. You can imagine with 351 cities and towns, not everyone feels the same. You have the town of Peru that probably has less than 500 people. You have P-Town, and then you have somewhere like Springfield or Boston that is a gateway city or a city. But there's a lot of towns and cities who say, you know, we don't even have a Black population. We don't know about police violence. Actually, our officers and my chief of police is an amazing guy. And so it takes a lot of convincing. And that's where you can help. Because for me to share the stories from my district that is deeply impacted by incarceration and police misconduct and prosecutorial misconduct, I need you. I need you to go to your senator and rep and say, I know that you don't think this issue is happening in Wellesley, but we care about justice and we care about equity. And this issue nationally can make Massachusetts a leader to ensure that we don't have a Tyree Nichols, we don't have a Sandra Bland or a George Floyd happening in our state. That's the internal game, pressure. That's what they call advocacy, policy changes. That is pressure on representatives and senators. The external game is the conversations, educating people about an issue that they may have no clue about. Why should Massachusetts reform our reproductive justice laws when we're so far ahead of places like Texas and Florida? And the reason why is because when something bad happens somewhere else in this country, Massachusetts often has to bear the brunt of being able to provide services to people who are coming from all over the country to say, I need an abortion. My child is a fetal anomaly. I can't carry this fetus to term. And those are the ways in which Massachusetts becomes a leader, is that even though we already have really extensive laws to protect birthing people, we want to make sure that no one goes to jail, no one dies, and no one is forced to go through a birthing process that is going to physically or mentally harm them if they don't choose to. After you do the internal and external game, it takes about 18 months, really, for a bill to go through this entire process of being assigned a committee, hearing testimony, and then it gets voted on. And once it gets voted on in a chamber, you want to figure out if it's going to pass out of committee. Remember, I said 6,500 bills, less than 500 of them actually get a hearing. And so the chances of a bill actually going through the process, I'm not good at math right here. If you take 500 out of 6,500, what's the percentage that a bill will even get a hearing? Then those bills get dwindled down for us to actually vote, have those bills get voted out of committee. In the state legislature, most people would tell you it takes about 2 to 3 terms, sometimes longer. When you think about marriage equality, how long it took to make that a law here in Massachusetts, almost 10 years. And so you have to be patient to understand that not everything is going to get passed like police reform. But with public pressure and alignment and coalition building, anything is possible if you want that process to go out of committee. And the last 3 steps is something that I share with folks all the time, is that it gets assigned to Ways and Means, then there's a floor vote, then it gets to conference committee. And a lot of people ask me, well, what's conference committee? Conference committee is the Senate and the House trying to agree. And we're very different bodies, and I'm learning this as a former representative. We have 40 people in the Senate, 160 in the House. And sometimes it feels incredibly hard to get anything done in the House because there's so many different fractions, but equally as hard in the Senate with folks representing 180,000 different people. After it goes through conference committee, we usually pass different versions and we try to get to a place where we actually can combine those two bills. And then once we agree, it goes to the governor's desk to sign. A bill does not become a law until the governor of Massachusetts, and thank God we've got a woman now, and a lieutenant governor who's a woman, and our first gay our first gay governor, to make sure that we actually can fight for greater equity and justice for different marginalized communities. And I hope that she will pass more bills in a quicker time frame. So those are my 7 to 10 steps on how I see a bill moving through that building. And I hope, I just want to say something to the league that really helped me. I was a member of the league. I think I need to pay my dues again. Just send that over. And I saw a packet at my first league meeting when I first became elected as a rep that was like 7 pages long. And it talked about all the steps when a bill becomes a law. And actually that was like my Bible. And no one knew this, but I actually studied that. And actually it made me a better legislator because I was so fearful that I wasn't an attorney. I didn't know how to write a bill. And that was my crash course on learning this topic. Now I've refined this. I've been able to pass 6 very important bills in the House in 3.5 years. And I hope that in the Senate, I will pass double that over my term, 2, 4, 6, 8 years. And God knows how long I'll be in the Senate. So thank you all for being a great audience. And I hope I didn't talk too fast. And folks got my sort of 7 to 10 steps and were inspired by my story.
Thank you so much, Senator Miranda. That was fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. It's such a privilege to work with you on all your policy priorities, are also priorities for the League of Women Voters. I wanted to know, do you prefer to have folks put questions in the chat? Do you have time for a few questions?
I do. I can take
great.
2 verbal ones and then I could use the chat, or I could just respond to a couple questions.
Great. Okay. Maybe if folks could use the raise hand feature, if you'd like to raise your hand and come off mute and ask Senator Miranda a question, we can take a couple of those and then we can use the chat. Great. Kathy, if you want to come off mute. There you go.
Hi, Senator. I'm so excited you're now a senator, and thank you so much for everything you do. I adore you. And I want to know how in the world you got 6 bills passed in our untransparent Massachusetts State House, where the power is all focused on the speaker. How in the world did you get through that boondoggle to get your bills passed?
I like to think it's like a triple trifecta. I think my smile and my personality is something that people have found warm, but I always in tandem with that smile and that personality, where I don't disrespect people, even if they differ in opinion from me, is the idea that I bring data and real facts. And so besides police reform, maternal health is a big area that I work on. And I'm not a mom yet, but the data spoke to the fact that Massachusetts, Black women are dying 2 to 3 times the rate of white women. And that is a story that even if you're a wealthy white woman who hasn't had any challenges with birth and you live in a place where you have great access to healthcare, you felt that. And so I oftentimes started my public discourse and educating my colleagues on issues they had no clue about by bringing in the stories of people. In my 5 years, or no, 4.5 actually, I just started actually in 4 and 3 months, sorry, I'm thinking ahead. I rarely get calls or emails about a piece of legislation. And after my second year, I was like, I know my community has challenges with these legislations, these different legislations. Why aren't they speaking? And what I realized is that internal game is only fortified by an external game. So I like to think that my second trifecta is I go as hard internally that I go externally. I don't know everything, but these coalitions, these organizations, these people with real lived experience, mothers who didn't make it through birth, or their children, or their family members who had to take care of their the offspring of family members, or practitioners who work in spaces that were really concerned about the maternal health crisis. They are the experts. And so uplifting them to be able to help me tell their stories is the second. The third, it's all about relationships. And, you know, there's something unique about when you feel like you have nothing to lose and everything to gain that makes you open. And so I walked into that building. I was like, I've never been to, for example, the town of Leominster. I've never been to, let's just say Pittsfield, for example. And I really did a lot of work to try to understand my colleagues, because I said, if I can build a relationship with leadership and with my colleagues, when I speak, they believe me. And that's a very important thing, because every rep and senator has their issues, has their constituency. And if you want them to believe what you're saying is a more sort of a more important thing, you have to have that relationship inside that building and outside that building. So I'm practicing more self-care now, but in my first 2 years, I crisscrossed the state. I learned as much as possible. And, you know, I like to think, you know, maybe my brother's out there somewhere in the universe just pushing me along. But because I knew that I could only go up, that I could only learn, I kind of was not scared. And I remembered what my mom told me when I ran. It was like, do it scared. And so I combined those three things: relationships, knowledge, and coalition building, and using, you know, the gift of my personality to actually push people to react and act as a matter of justice. You know, it was very uncomfortable. I'm not going to tell you here. There were many nights during police reform that I went home and cried. And I just couldn't understand why my colleagues couldn't understand why I wanted to ban no-knock warrants. You know, I gave an impassioned speech about that I could have been Breonna Taylor, that we've lost children to no-knock warrants. We've lost elders, even in Massachusetts. There's a story of an elder in Framingham that died due to the wrong apartment, and no-knock warrant being issued to a wrong apartment. And so, but I took that pain, and just like in 2018 that I ran for office, I kind of used that to say, we're going to pass something. Now, not everything that I wrote in my bill was included, but 95% of what I wanted in the final bill was included because of this coalition of over 100 people, like the League, like doctors who said this was their lane, even though they had never done policy before. So I hope that helped.
May we all follow in your footsteps. Yes, yes, yes. You're awesome.
Thank you, Jen. I have the suffragettes behind me, and you know,
You do.
200 years of Wellesley women and Wellesley siblings who are also
You
behind.
do.
And your brother's got your back. He's right there with you.
I can feel it.
Yep.
China Map. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name.
I'm going to lower my hand. Thank you. I was wondering if there's a place that you start, like let's say there's a piece of legislation or a bill that you'd like to write, and it's something that it's new to you, your constituents want it, but it's not something that you're well versed in. Is there a place that is normally your go-to place where you start your research?
This is a double-edged sword, because one of the ways that we have by law in Massachusetts is you can reach out to your senator or your rep and say, I want you to file a bill. And we do it by request. And we normally go to our House counsel and our Senate counsel to help us draft these bills if you have nothing on paper. But a lot of times, to be honest, by request bills are frowned upon. And so it's sad that we have this mechanism for the people to feel empowered about an issue. And then it's frowned upon, and it takes a really long time because Senate counsel and House counsel just don't have the time. Imagine 160 people and 40 other legislators that are trying to get your attention to help them write a bill. And so my advice to when people come to me, I still want you to call or email or send a letter to your elected official, because they should make time to talk to you and for you to tell them, I don't know where to start. But the most important thing your senator or rep can do is they might be able to point you in the right direction to a colleague that has that level of expertise. So now in the State House, when folks bring up reproductive justice stuff, or they bring up criminal justice stuff, or they bring up maternal health or environmental justice, my colleagues know there's a handful of people who know a lot about that issue. And so they'll send people my way. But the advocacy organization is probably the best way to start. And if you're not a lawyer, a lot of this is old speak language. It's still very difficult to write a bill because laws are not easy to understand. It's designed that way. Chapter 3.5 XYZ, and they have all these numbers and all these statements written in them. And so those are the first 3 steps. But if you have an idea, you can reach out to me. And as long as you give me like a week, I get 100 plus emails a day. I can connect you to either your legislator or an advocacy organization that I think is working on the issue to help you. But that's where I went first. Remember my first bill, I went to the ACLU and I asked them, I said, do you guys write legislation on this? And they said, we can't do it alone, but if you get a bunch of people who work in racial justice, maybe we can craft something up. And the last thing I'll say is no idea really feels new at this point. And so there's probably a national organization or a bill in another state that's been written or filed or discussed that you can kind of take their language and adopt it to Massachusetts. So that's another place that you can go. It's like, for example, I believe in universal basic income, particularly for kids coming out of foster care. It feels sad to me that you're 18 years old, you get kicked out of foster care. And in particularly Boston, how do you survive? How do you survive with no job, no state funds, and no sort of income to be able to help you, survive and thrive? And there was a bill in California, I just Googled universal basic income for young people aging out of foster care. And I found that bill and I brought it to Massachusetts, and I actually filed a 1-line bill because I knew I need to take time to work on the bill, but I had a deadline of January 20th, and we're still working on that bill. But now there is a placeholder that's holding a universal basic income bill while I try to find people who care a lot about the issue. And once I shared that, More Than Words, which is an organization in Waltham and here in the South End, said, we're seeing so many young people coming out of DCF that this could really help. And we'd love to help you write this bill and form a coalition around the bill. So hope I answered that.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, Pamela, and then maybe we can do some in the chat.
Thank you very much for your work and the enthusiasm and the intelligence you bring. The things that matter the most to me are being blocked by the lack of transparency, because they're things that would benefit everybody and that are low-hanging fruit of being both cheaper and better, like a bottle bill, which covers all single-use drinks, including plastic water, that would put the economic responsibility back on the manufacturer, yes, where it belongs, and not on the consumer who has no power. But because the legislature is so opaque and you can't even tell who votes for what, it's never coming up. It keeps not being brought up. And it would also be a great boon to homeless people who get most of their money often from collecting deposits on the street and turning them in for cash. And the other issue is the electrification of transportation, particularly school buses, which is an environmental justice issue because particularly like Metco kids spend hours on those buses and they need clean buses. And the buses can also be used for all kinds of good things. How do we get the legislature to be transparent enough so that the obvious good bills actually get through when they're opposed by powerful corporate interests? The corporate interests always get through. Is there a route for making it transparent?
I have an easy answer and then I have a more difficult one. I consider myself a progressive legislator. But in many of the progressive spaces, I've shared that there's really a lack of diversity. And I think if progressive organizations, and I've shared this with Progressive Mass, JPP, Progressives, for example, that they need to create bodies in other communities that are more reflective of the state's diversity to make their issues that can cross cut racial issues, gender issues. And I'll give you an example. In Roxbury, transparency is not the most important issue. If you've lost your kid to homicide, you're being kicked out of or evicted out of your apartment, so you don't have shelter. The bus doesn't work for you to get to your job or school, or you're suffering with food insecurity. Those are your basic needs. And so therefore you're focused on, can I get these basic needs met? And so there's a lack of connection between well-meaning, powerful legislation that's incredibly important, including transparency and accountability of the state legislature, but it's not trickling down to other people that you could join forces with. And so, for example, in my district, I've recommended to JP Progressives and West Roxbury and Rosendale Progressives to think about, could they do a RoxDOT Progressives to be able to actually build bridges with folks that care about a lot of different issues to say, we're going to make your issue important, and your issue is as important as the thing that I really want to fight on. And you're right, not a lot of organizations can pay lobbyists to go to the State House, and some cases not only badger, but kind of buy the vote by supporting or pushing their friends who they get to golf with or hang out with to pass key legislation. But I still believe that there's a power in the people of Massachusetts. And technically, when you vote for someone, they have to be transparent and accountable to you. And I hope that in my lifetime as a senator, those transparency bills that from Act on Mass and progressive organizations will pass. But for right now, what we have is a huge challenge and block because not all 200 legislators feel the same. And I want to tell you that I really do support the bottle ban because I live in a community in Roxbury that there's a trash transfer station. People in Roxbury are dying 30 to 33 years ahead of people who live in the Back Bay, just 10 stops on the #1 bus away. And 100% of Cambridge's trash comes to Roxbury. So you have a community like Cambridge that is very progressive, that is harming my community because 100% of their trash is coming to my neighborhood and it's burned and it's, packed into these warehouses, basically 3 blocks from my house. And so we're continuing to die or have 5 times the asthma rate. And the reason why people don't know that is because the people in my community, many of them don't speak good English. Many of them are working second or third shift. They can't go to the State House. They don't even know who the EEA commissioner or secretary is. So it's my job as a senator or representative to work with my population. So I don't know if I have another easier answer, but then holding your rep and senator accountable. But I think joining forces with other organizations is the way to go to make sure that your issue gets across the finish line, but other folks' issues. And I did see the question about home rule petitions, and I hope the league will provide me maybe a document or a transcript of what some folks shared so that I can be able to respond when I have more time.
No problem. We're happy to do that. Maybe if there was just one last question in the chat, and then we could just say thank you and sign off for tonight. But if one particular question popped out that you wanted to answer from the chat, we can close there. I think there was one if you're sponsoring any democracy legislation this session.
Yeah, you know, in the Votes Act, you mentioned that I worked on jail-based voting. And the reason why I worked on that, not just because of my family background, my father, all my brothers did time in the state penitentiary here. And we have huge racial disparities. Black juveniles are 8 times to 10 times more likely as white juveniles for the same crime to be sentenced and be sentenced for longer periods of time. And Latino young people are 7 to 9 times more likely. And actually in Massachusetts, the Latino to white ratio of incarceration of juveniles is the worst in the country. And so these are things that people don't necessarily know. And when I learned that there were 8,000 to 10,000 citizens and residents of the state in pretrial detention or had misdemeanors that had the right to vote, but weren't getting the access to the ballot. And I knew that many of them were Black and brown, and coming from communities like myself, when we were talking about same-day registration, I was also talking about we need to return the right to vote and the access in houses of correction and DOC to make sure that folks from our communities know that they can still vote for people. And that was very important because democracy that is denied to people that not only have the right, but deserve to get access to the ballot is how we have such a lopsided system in the Commonwealth, because folks are coming from Roxbury, being incarcerated in Concord or Norfolk, which are towns that think very differently about the democratic process. And sometimes they're red or blue, red or purple versus being blue, because although they count those incarcerated individuals in their census, they do not allow them the access to the ballot as a resident of that state to be able to determine what things they'd like to see. And so this year, I actually am fighting for felony enfranchisement, because we actually in the state of Massachusetts used to allow folks who even committed a felony still the right to vote. If we keep calling this a Department of Correction, and this is the place where people are rehabbed, and then we got to make sure that folks are getting to the ballot. And so I've worked with Common Cause, Mass Voter Table, Mass Vote to ensure that as we're continuing to make reforms in voting and democracy here in the Commonwealth, that we leave nobody behind. People who are incarcerated have stories, they have families, they're not throwaway people. And many times we like to think that they're all bad people, but sometimes they just were people who couldn't afford a great lawyer and someone who didn't get a second chance when they really needed it at the age of 18. And I say to people, and I'll just end here, I am not the same woman at 42 I was when I was 18. And none of us are the worst thing we've ever done. And none of us are the worst days of our lives. And so I want to make sure that we're thinking about democracy with little d and big D at the same time. And so thank you all for being a part of my audience tonight. I have to go. I have actually one more meeting. I'm so tired. But I want to thank the league, and I hope to join you all, not only as an active member, but a partner in Massachusetts legislature. There are a lot of good people in that building. And if I can help connect you to them to help further your priorities, please let me know. And thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you so much, Senator Miranda. Good night, everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much for all
you.
you do. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Hope to see you on March 28th and 29th. Take care.